For 12 years, I poured every ounce of my brilliant financial mind into building my husband's $24.8 million real estate empire. I stayed in the shadows so he could play the big shot CEO. But on the night of our 12th wedding anniversary, instead of a diamond ring, he handed me a divorce paper, wrapped his arm around his 21-year-old secretary, and gave me exactly 2 hours to pack my bags and get out of my own mansion. I thought he was throwing away a useless, aging wife to start a new life with his pregnant mistress. He had no idea I was the sole owner of a master holding contract that controlled every single penny he thought he had. I did not cry. I just smiled, packed one small suitcase, and walked out to let him dig his own grave. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing a romantic candlelit dinner for our 12th anniversary. The prime rib was resting in the oven. The expensive bottle of Cabernet was breathing on the granite counter of our multi-million-dollar California estate. I was upstairs, slipping into the black silk dress Richard used to love when the intercom buzzed. It was his voice, cold and impatient, echoing through the master bedroom, telling me to come down to the living room immediately. I thought he had a surprise for me. My heart did a little flutter. At 52, after years of grueling behind-the-scenes work structuring the very foundations of his company, I thought we had finally reached the easy part of our lives. I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase with a soft smile on my face. But the smile vanished the second my feet hit the marble floor. Richard was not alone. He was standing by the fireplace in his tailored Italian suit. Clinging to his arm like a cheap accessory was Chloe. She was 21. She was the junior secretary he had hired 6 months ago. She was wearing a tight pink dress and chewing gum, looking around my immaculate living room as if she was already planning how to redecorate it. Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of the scene, Richard tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the glass coffee table. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. He did not even have the decency to look guilty. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and utter contempt. He pointed at the papers and told me to sign them because we were getting a divorce. The air left my lungs. Blood ran cold in my veins. I stood there frozen, staring at the man I had pulled from the brink of bankruptcy over a decade ago. When I met him, he was drowning in debt. I used my expertise as a senior financial analyst to build the intricate corporate structures that saved him. I stepped back, let him take the title of CEO, and played the quiet, supportive wife. Now he was looking at me like I was garbage. I asked him what this was about. My voice was eerily calm, though a hurricane was brewing in my chest. Richard pulled Chloe closer. He placed a possessive hand on her flat stomach. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Chloe is pregnant. I am finally going to get the son you could never give me. You are old, Claire. You are tired. You do not fit into the image of a top-tier CEO anymore. Chloe is young and vibrant, and she is the future of my family. I want you out of this house tonight." Chloe giggled softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. She looked at me with big, innocent eyes that held nothing but venom. She actually had the nerve to say she was sorry, but she and Richard just connected on a soul level. She told me it was just time for me to move on. My heart stopped, not from heartbreak, but from the sheer audacity. They were standing in a house I paid the initial down payment for, demanding I leave because my husband wanted to upgrade to a younger model. Richard checked his expensive gold watch. He told me he was giving me exactly 2 hours to pack my personal belongings. He warned me not to try to take anything valuable because his lawyers had already documented every asset in the house. He said if I tried to fight this in court, he would bury me. He reminded me that I had been unemployed for 12 years and had no income and no power. He told me to walk away quietly, and maybe he would toss me a small alimony check to keep me off the streets. I thought he had me cornered. He thought because I had not worked a corporate job in 12 years, I was just a helpless, aging housewife. He forgot who built him. He forgot who designed the entire legal framework of his precious real estate firm. He was blinded by his own inflated ego and the young girl hanging off his arm. He truly believed he was the untouchable king of his empire. He forgot the countless nights I stayed awake analyzing market trends while he slept soundly. He forgot the personal investments I liquidated to keep his initial projects afloat when banks laughed in his face. He looked at my 52-year-old face and only saw wrinkles and exhaustion. He did not see the sharp, calculating mind of the woman who held the strings to his entire life. The imbalance of power he thought he had over me was the most hilarious delusion I had ever witnessed. I looked at the divorce petition sitting on the glass table. Then I looked at Richard's smug face and Chloe's triumphant smirk. A strange sense of clarity washed over me. The man I loved was gone, and in his place was a greedy, arrogant stranger who had just handed me the weapon for his own destruction. I did not scream. I did not throw the expensive wine at them. I did not fall to my knees and beg him to remember our vows or the sacrifices I made. I let him have his moment of perceived victory. I let him feel like a god. Instead, I reached down, picked up the divorce petition, and I smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that made Richard shift uncomfortably for just a split second. Welcome to my channel. Before I tell you exactly how I used my secret master holding contract to legally strip this arrogant man of every single dollar property and ounce of dignity, he had take a quick second to engage with me. Drop a comment right now telling me which city you are watching from and what time it is. If you have ever dealt with a narcissistic partner who thought they were smarter than you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss a single detail of this absolute destruction. Let us get back to the story. Holding the papers in my hand, I looked Richard in the eye and agreed. I told him I would pack my things and be gone in less than 2 hours. I did not argue about the house or the money. I just turned around and walked back up the grand staircase, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. They expected tears and hysteria. They got absolute compliance. But what they did not know was that my compliance was the first step in a master plan that would leave them both begging for mercy. I turned my back on the two of them and walked slowly up the grand sweeping staircase. My hand glided along the custom mahogany railing I had painstakingly picked out 3 years ago. Every step I took was deliberate and unhurried. Behind me down in the living room, I could hear Richard whispering to Chloe. He was probably telling her that I was completely broken and deep in denial. Let them think exactly that. The truth was, my mind was operating at 100 miles an hour. I was mentally cataloging every asset, every offshore account, and every shell company I had meticulously structured over the past decade. When I reached the master bedroom, the familiar scent of my expensive French perfume still lingered in the cool air. The massive room was a sprawling testament to the immense wealth I had quietly built from the ground up. Heavy velvet curtains draped gracefully over floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a manicured lawn and a private tennis court. I walked past the oversized king bed and headed straight into the massive walk-in closet. The closet was filled with designer bags, silk evening gowns, and velvet-lined boxes of diamond jewelry, but I was not here for any of that luxury. I walked straight past the endless racks of custom Chanel suits and pristine Prada shoes. I reached up and pulled a small, scuffed leather suitcase from the very back of the highest shelf. It was the exact same suitcase I had brought with me when Richard and I first moved into a tiny, cramped apartment over a decade ago. Back then, he was drowning in a sea of bad debt and facing multiple aggressive lawsuits. I opened the worn leather bag and started tossing in the absolute bare minimum. A couple of plain cotton t-shirts, a pair of faded blue jeans, some comfortable walking shoes, a simple oversized gray sweater. I did not touch the heavy diamond necklaces. I did not take the luxury skincare products lined up on the marble vanity. I was voluntarily leaving the physical trap he thought he controlled because I knew deep down I held the invisible legal keys to the entire kingdom. The heavy bedroom door creaked open behind me. Richard leaned against the doorframe, watching me with a smug, highly satisfied expression on his face. He crossed his arms over his expensive tailored chest and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet room. He told me he honestly expected a much bigger fight from me tonight. He said he fully expected I would be throwing expensive crystal vases and screaming my head off like a hysterical, bitter old woman. He walked further into the room, letting his expensive leather shoes sink into the plush white carpet. He looked down at the pathetic little pile of faded clothes inside my small suitcase and scoffed loudly. He actually asked me if I had lost my mind entirely. He said the shock of the divorce must have completely fried my aging brain because I was willingly leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of clothes and accessories behind. I kept my head down and focused intently on folding a gray cotton shirt. I let him talk. Silence is always the most lethal weapon when your enemy is desperate for an emotional reaction. He took my complete silence as a total surrender. He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice into a cruel, menacing whisper. He told me to listen to him very carefully. He said if I even entertained the thought of going to a lawyer to demand half of his real estate company or a piece of this estate, he would absolutely destroy me. He bragged about the ruthless corporate legal team he kept on a massive retainer. He reminded me that those men charged over $1,000 an hour, and they would deliberately drag out any divorce settlement until I was completely bankrupt and living in a cardboard box on the streets. He said he had made absolutely sure my name was not listed on any of the recent property deeds or major bank accounts. He truly thought he was giving me a masterclass in financial dominance. He told me I was nothing without his name. He called me a dusty relic of his past and said I should be incredibly grateful he was even allowing me to pack my own personal items before kicking me out. I then casually mentioned that Chloe was already hiring contractors to turn my private home office into a luxury nursery for his new male heir. Every single arrogant word that spilled from his mouth was like beautiful music to my ears. He was so incredibly stupid. He genuinely believed that just because he signed the public checks and posed smiling for the local business magazine covers, he was the one actually in charge of the empire. He had absolutely no idea that the very lawyers he was using to threaten me answered directly to a private holding company that I owned 100%. He had no idea that the property deeds he proudly kept locked in his wall safe were entirely subordinate to a master trust agreement. He had blindly signed 5 years ago when I convinced him it was simply for corporate tax optimization. I finished zipping the small leather suitcase and finally looked up to meet his gaze. I did not look angry. I did not look devastated or sad. I just gave him a soft, pitying smile. I told him he did not need to worry about me fighting him for his money. I said I sincerely hoped he and Chloe would be very happy living in this big house together. The genuine calm in my steady voice clearly unsettled him. I saw a brief, fleeting flicker of deep confusion in his dark eyes, but his massive, fragile ego quickly squashed it down. He stepped aside and gestured aggressively toward the hallway, telling me my 2 hours were up and the taxi he called was already waiting out by the front gates. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and walked out of the bedroom without looking back. I descended this grand staircase for the very last time. Down in the foyer, Chloe was busy taking pictures of herself in the massive, ornate mirror by the door. She barely even glanced at me as I walked past them both. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool evening air. The massive iron security gates of the estate stood wide open. A bright yellow taxi was idling quietly at the end of the long, circular driveway. I did not turn around to look at the house. I climbed into the back seat of the cab, pulled the door shut, and told the driver to just drive toward the downtown area. The bright city lights blurred past the window as the taxi sped down the dark highway. For the first 10 minutes of the ride, I just sat quietly in the back seat, taking slow, deep breaths to steady my racing heart. The initial adrenaline of the confrontation was finally starting to settle down in my veins. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my banking application, intending to book a secure room at a modest hotel downtown. I needed a quiet, safe place to set up my laptop and officially initiate the legal destruction of Richard's entire life. But as I tried to process the quick hotel reservation, a bright red error message flashed aggressively across my screen. Transaction declined. I frowned and tapped the screen again. Same message. I quickly opened the main joint checking account we always used for our daily household expenses. The available balance read 0. The account had been completely frozen. My heart beat a little faster as I quickly checked my secondary credit cards. Declined, suspended, blocked. I checked the emergency savings account. Access denied. Richard had not just kicked me out of my own house in the middle of the night. He had immediately called his private banker the moment I walked upstairs and ruthlessly cut off my access to every single dollar we shared. He wanted to make absolutely sure I could not even buy a cheap bottle of water or a warm meal. I wanted me, desperate, terrified, and crawling back to the estate to beg for his scraps by morning. The taxi driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror and asked exactly where we were heading, because the meter was running high and we were approaching the city limits. I stared blindly at the red decline notifications illuminating my glowing screen. Richard truly thought he had cleverly severed my only lifeline. He thought he had trapped me in a dark corner with absolutely no financial way out. A cold, ruthless laugh suddenly escaped my lips, startling the driver in the front seat. I leaned forward and told the driver to keep heading straight into the heart of the city and assured him I would pay the full fare in cash. I reached deep into my purse and felt the thick, heavy envelope of emergency $100 bills I had quietly withdrawn weeks ago. I had started pulling cash the exact same day I first noticed Chloe wearing a custom diamond tennis bracelet I knew Richard had recently purchased. The waiting game was officially over. The war had begun, and Richard had just made his first fatal mistake. The bright yellow taxi pulled to a stop in front of a flickering neon sign that read Starlight Motel. The word star was entirely burnt out, leaving only a buzzing red light that cast long, unsettling shadows across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. I handed the driver a crisp $50 bill, told him to keep the change, and stepped out into the humid night air. The heavy humidity clung to my skin, instantly contrasting sharply with the climate-controlled perfection of the mansion I had just been thrown out of. I gripped the handle of my small, scuffed leather suitcase and walked toward the bulletproof glass of the night manager window. A bored-looking clerk with heavy bags under his eyes barely looked up from his small portable television when I approached. I asked for a single room for the night. He slid a worn plastic clipboard under the small gap in the thick glass and mumbled a price that was less than what Richard usually spent on a single glass of premium whiskey. I pulled my sleek platinum credit card from my designer wallet. It felt heavy and cold in my palm. For over a decade, this little piece of metal had opened doors to luxury suites in Paris and private dining rooms in Manhattan. I slid it under the glass. The clerk swiped the card through his old dusty terminal. The machine beeped a harsh flat tone. He frowned and tried it again. Another flat beep echoed in the quiet lobby. He looked up at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity and told me the card was completely declined. He said the system was showing a total block on the account. I felt a brief flash of heat rise in my chest, but I quickly pushed it down. Richard was moving faster than I anticipated, trying to humiliate me at every possible turn. He wanted me, stranded in the middle of the night, begging a stranger to let me sleep in the lobby. He wanted me to feel the absolute crushing weight of sudden poverty, hoping it would break my spirit before the sun even came up. I did not break. I simply nodded. Reached back into my leather bag and pulled out the thick envelope of emergency cash I had been secretly hoarding for the past 3 weeks. I counted out the exact amount in $20 bills and slid them under the glass partition. The clerk raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sudden influx of hard currency from a woman whose premium credit card had just bounced. He handed me a physical brass key attached to a heavy plastic diamond and pointed toward a row of faded green doors at the far end of the gloomy property. Room number 12 smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial pine cleaner. The carpet was a questionable shade of brown, and the floral bedspread looked like it had survived the previous 3 decades without a single proper washing. I locked the flimsy wooden door behind me and threw the deadbolt. I walked over to the small wobbly desk in the corner of the room and gently set down my suitcase. I did not bother unpacking my few plain articles of clothing. I unzipped the front pocket of the bag and pulled out the only item that truly mattered tonight: my silver laptop. I sat down on the edge of the lumpy mattress and opened the screen. The bright white light illuminated the dark, dingy room. As the operating system booted up, my mind drifted back 12 years ago. The stark contrast between this filthy motel and my actual net worth was darkly poetic. 12 years ago, Richard was sitting in a room just like this one. I was completely broke, drowning in millions of dollars of toxic commercial real estate debt and facing multiple federal investigations for gross financial negligence. His former business partners had abandoned him. His creditors were circling him like hungry vultures. I was a broken, pathetic man weeping into his hands when I first found him. I was a rising star at a prestigious corporate restructuring firm at the time. I saw something in him that no one else did. He had a charming smile and a relentless ability to sell a grand vision to cautious investors. But he had absolutely no brain for the actual mechanics of money. So I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. I spent countless sleepless nights untangling his massive web of hidden liabilities. I personally negotiated with ruthless bank managers to restructure his bad loans. I designed a brilliant labyrinth of holding companies and limited liability partnerships that legally shielded his remaining assets from immediate seizure. I breathed life back into a corpse of a company and built a rock-solid foundation that would eventually generate tens of millions of dollars in pure, unadulterated profit. But I knew the corporate real estate world was deeply biased. I knew that old, wealthy investors preferred doing business with a tall, handsome, charismatic man rather than a sharp, analytical woman who asked far too many difficult questions. So I made a strategic choice. I stepped completely into the shadows. I let Richard put his name on the shiny new letterhead. I let him stand at the podium during the grand ribbon-cutting ceremonies, while I stood quietly in the back of the room holding his coat. I let him take all the credit for the magnificent financial empire I had meticulously engineered from scratch. I gave him the golden crown and chose to rule quietly from behind the heavy velvet curtain. Over the years, he actually started to believe his own marketing materials. He started believing that he was a self-made genius who single-handedly conquered the competitive real estate market. He conveniently forgot about the grueling nights I spent rewriting his terrible commercial contracts. He forgot about the brilliant tax strategies I implemented that saved him millions every single fiscal quarter. His ego inflated to massive, dangerous proportions, feeding on the constant praise of sycophants and the adoring gazes of young, naive employees like Chloe. I truly believed that by cutting off my credit cards tonight, he was severing my only source of survival. He thought he was starving a helpless, dependent housewife. He had no idea that the woman sitting on this lumpy motel bed in the dead of night was the true architect of his entire reality. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password and hit enter. The screen loaded into my secure encrypted server. I watched the green text scroll across the dark background, connecting me to the hidden financial nervous system of his entire world. The credit cards he blocked were just meaningless pieces of plastic. The real money, the massive corporate accounts, the lucrative property deeds, and the offshore trust funds were all right here waiting patiently at my fingertips. I smiled in the quiet darkness of the cheap motel room. It was time to start systematically dismantling the empire. The cool silver metal of my laptop was a stark contrast to the sticky, worn-out blanket underneath it. I sat cross-legged on the lumpy motel mattress and stared at the glowing login screen. This was not a normal banking website or a standard public interface. This was a private, highly encrypted portal hosted on a secure offshore server. I slowly typed in my credentials. First, a complex 12-character alphanumeric password, then a secondary biometric confirmation using the built-in fingerprint scanner on my keyboard. Finally, a tertiary rotating security key generated by a specialized application on my phone. Richard did not even know this hidden digital portal existed. He honestly thought the quarterly financial reports his hired accountants handed him were the absolute top level of his corporate structure. He was painfully wrong. As the system authenticated my identity, a massive dashboard loaded. A beautiful cascading stream of numbers, corporate structures, and legally binding documents populated the screen. I navigated past the daily profit charts and clicked directly on the core foundational folder labeled Master Holding. Seeing the original digital document staring back at me brought a sudden rush of profound satisfaction. 12 years ago, when I stepped in to rescue Richard from the absolute brink of total financial ruin, I made absolutely sure to protect my own immense labor. The massive real estate empire he paraded around town was officially registered with the state as a standard limited liability company. But what he conveniently ignored, or perhaps simply forgot over the years, was the sole parent entity of that specific company. The primary operating agreement clearly stated that his lucrative real estate business was actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Master Holding. And Master Holding was a completely private trust fund, where I was legally listed as the sole primary beneficiary and the ultimate executive owner. Richard was never the true boss of the empire. His official title on paper was simply an authorized executive officer. I had granted him the legal power to sign daily operational checks, negotiate commercial property leases, and hire or fire lower-level staff. I let him play the big, powerful chief executive officer because it stroked his incredibly fragile ego and kept the skeptical older investors happy. But buried deep in Section 4, Paragraph B of the Master Operating Agreement was a golden revocation clause. It explicitly stated that the sole owner of Master Holding could immediately and unilaterally revoke all of his executive privileges without any prior notice or legal justification. I held the ultimate kill switch. With just a few simple clicks of my mouse, I could legally strip him of his fancy title, his access to the massive corporate bank accounts, and his ability to make a single business decision. He was merely a temporary tenant in a towering financial house that I owned free and clear. I took a slow, deep breath and navigated away from the foundational contracts. I needed to see exactly how much immediate damage he had done in the past month while he was busy planning his new life. I opened the live general ledger. I fully expected to see the usual high corporate expenses that I usually ignored. Expensive steak dinners with potential clients, luxury car leases, maybe a few overpriced diamond bracelets for his new little secretary. But as my eyes scanned the recent outgoing wire transfers, a massive, glaring red flag caught my immediate attention. My heart began to pound a steady rhythmic beat against my ribs. I leaned much closer to the glowing screen, squinting at the digital ledger. Last Tuesday, an unauthorized wire transfer of $2.5 million had been executed directly from the primary corporate escrow account. That specific account was strictly and legally designated for holding client deposits on massive commercial properties. Moving any money out of that specific account for personal use was not just a simple violation of standard company policy. It was blatant illegal embezzlement. I quickly traced the routing number attached to the massive transfer. It did not go to a standard vendor or a partner construction firm. It went directly to a newly formed private residential trust account, a trust account registered under the exact legal name of Chloe. My blood ran completely cold and then immediately boiled hot. Richard was not just buying a few nice expensive gifts to keep her happy. He was actively siphoning millions of dollars out of the operational lifeblood of our commercial real estate firm. He was blatantly stealing client money to buy a luxury property for a 21-year-old girl. He was risking federal prison just to impress a pregnant secretary. I quickly pulled up the local state property registry database in a new browser tab and ran a detailed search on the destination trust. Within seconds, the official results populated on my screen. It was a sprawling 5,000-square-foot luxury penthouse located in the most expensive downtown district of the city. The listing described floor-to-ceiling windows, a private rooftop pool, and a custom-built nursery. The final deed of sale had been officially recorded and finalized just 3 days ago. I was draining the company dry right under my nose. He thought because he had locked my personal credit cards and thrown me out of the house into the night, he had completely neutralized my power. He thought I was sitting in the dark somewhere crying over a broken marriage and begging for mercy. Instead, I was sitting in a cheap motel room watching him commit federal wire fraud in real time. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his crime was breathtaking. If the state regulatory board audited that escrow account today, the entire company would face immediate seizure and catastrophic ruin. He was playing an incredibly dangerous, reckless game with money that ultimately belonged to my master trust. Every single dollar he stole from that company was a dollar he was stealing directly from me. I downloaded the transaction receipts. I saved the digital signatures. I captured every single IP address and timestamp associated with the illegal wire transfers. My fingers flew across the keyboard, building an airtight digital fortress of undeniable evidence. I organized the documents into a highly secure encrypted folder titled Federal Violations. The arrogant divorce petition he threw in my face earlier tonight was an absolute joke. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute over who got to keep the fancy house and the nice cars. This was a massive corporate crime. By attempting to secure a luxurious future for his new mistress, Richard had unknowingly handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. I gently closed the laptop and sat in the quiet, dim light of the motel room. The buzzing neon sign outside flickered, casting a harsh red glow across the dingy carpet. Tomorrow morning, he would wake up in his comfortable, king-sized bed, feeling like an absolute conqueror. He would take his new young girlfriend out for an expensive brunch. He would laugh about how easily he got rid of his aging, useless wife. Let him laugh. Let him feel completely invincible. The bigger his ego grew, the harder he was going to fall. I laid my head down on the scratchy motel pillow, not to cry, but to carefully plan my next calculated move. The hunt had officially begun, and I was not going to stop until I took back everything. The harsh morning sun sliced through the gap in the thin floral curtains of the cheap motel room. I had not slept a single second. I had spent the entire night sitting cross-legged on that lumpy mattress, digging through 12 years of hidden financial data. My eyes were burning and my lower back was stiff, but my mind had never been sharper. The initial shock of being thrown out of my own home had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculated focus. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the small plastic desk. I looked absolutely exhausted. My hair was messy and there were deep, dark circles under my eyes. It was the perfect visual for a defeated, broken woman. But inside, I was an apex predator meticulously setting up a lethal trap. I walked over to the small sink, splashed some cold tap water on my face, and took a deep breath of the stale motel air. It was time to make my very first strategic move. I needed Richard to feel like he was the absolute, undisputed king of the world. I needed him so high on his own perceived power that he would never bother looking down to see the massive sinkhole I was digging right under his expensive leather shoes. I sat back down in front of my glowing laptop screen. The encrypted portal to my master holding trust was still highly active. I opened a specialized data extraction program I had personally designed years ago for internal corporate audits. I needed a complete mirror copy of every single fraudulent transaction he had executed over the past 6 months. I needed every illegal wire transfer from the client escrow accounts. I needed every forged signature on the commercial property deeds. I needed every hidden email correspondence between him and his shady offshore real estate brokers. But downloading gigabytes of secure financial data takes significant time, and it inherently leaves a digital footprint on the active server. If Richard happened to log into his dummy executive dashboard while I was running the mass extraction, he might notice the system lagging or see an automated server alert. I needed to distract him. I needed to occupy his small, arrogant mind so completely that he would not even think about checking the company servers this morning. And I knew exactly how to play him. I reached for my cell phone and dialed his private personal number. I let the phone ring once, twice, 3 times. I knew he was staring at his glowing screen, letting it ring deliberately just to make me wait. He always loved playing those petty little psychological power games. On the 5th ring, the line finally clicked open. Before he could even say a single word, I completely dropped my emotional guard. I let my breathing become ragged and shallow. I forced my voice to crack and tremble. I called his name, sounding pathetic and entirely broken. I asked him where he was and told him I was so incredibly scared. The sound of his smug, satisfied chuckle echoed loudly through the phone speaker. He sounded like he was sitting outside on the massive stone patio of my estate, probably enjoying a cup of expensive imported coffee while looking out over the private tennis court. He did not ask if I was safe. He did not ask where I had slept last night. He simply asked me if I had enjoyed my first night living in the real world among the peasants. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a soft, pathetic sob into the receiver. I begged him to please unfreeze just one of the joint checking accounts. I told him I only had a few wrinkled dollars left in my purse and I desperately needed to buy something to eat. I pleaded with him, saying he could keep the massive house and the luxury cars, but surely he would not let his loyal wife of 12 years starve on the streets. As I was whimpering and crying into the phone, my right hand was resting completely steady on the laptop trackpad. My face was completely deadpan. There was absolutely no emotion in my eyes. I clicked the execute button on the mass data extraction software. A bright green progress bar appeared on the dark screen, slowly ticking from 1% to 2%. The digital vault was officially unlocking and dumping his entire criminal history directly onto my encrypted local hard drive. Richard let out a loud theatrical sigh. He told me I was being incredibly dramatic and pathetic. Then I heard a soft rustling sound in the background and a familiar high-pitched giggle. Chloe was right there, sitting next to him. Richard lowered his voice, speaking directly to her, but making absolutely sure I could hear every single word. He told his young secretary to listen closely to what a desperate, washed-up gold digger sounded like. He actually boasted to her that he was recording this entire phone call to play for his wealthy friends at the country club later this week. He wanted to show everyone in our elite social circle how completely dependent and helpless I was without his money. Chloe laughed loudly into the microphone and told him I sounded completely pathetic. She told Richard to put me on speakerphone so she could hear my humiliation more clearly. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of their actions would have absolutely crushed a normal woman. But to me, it was the greatest strategic gift he could have possibly given me. His massive, inflated ego was blinding him to the reality of his situation. I ramped up the performance. I started hyperventilating slightly, making sure the phone microphone caught every single gasping breath. I begged him to just send me $500. I told him I would sign whatever divorce papers he wanted if he would just give me enough cash to survive the week and find a small apartment. I sounded like a wounded animal backed into a dark corner. Meanwhile, on the computer screen, the green progress bar hit 40%. I calmly typed in a secondary administrative command to bypass the internal firewall protecting the company escrow ledgers. I was seamlessly copying the exact routing numbers he had used to illegally funnel $2.5 million of client money into Chloe's private residential trust. I watched the digital signatures verifying his identity on those illegal transfers clone themselves directly into my secure evidence folder. I was crying hysterically into the phone while simultaneously securing the exact federal evidence required to put him in a maximum security prison for the next decade. The stark contrast between the helpless victim he was listening to and the ruthless architect dismantling his life was incredibly satisfying. Richard finally grew bored of my fake misery. The progress bar on my screen hit 98%. I needed just a few more seconds of his undivided attention. I let out one final loud wail and begged him to remember the early days of our marriage when we promised to always protect each other against the world. That was the perfect psychological trigger. He laughed a cold, mean-spirited laugh that would make anyone sick to their stomach. He told me the past was dead and I was completely dead to him. He said I was a useless parasite who had finally been permanently cut loose from his majestic host body. He advised me to go find a minimum wage job at a local diner flipping burgers because that was the only thing my advanced age and total lack of modern skills qualified me for. He told me to never call his private number again unless I was ready to unconditionally surrender to his legal terms. The download progress bar hit 100%. A small green notification popped up confirming that all 4 gigabytes of his criminal financial data had been successfully secured and fully encrypted on my portable drive. I did not say another word. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and let the line go completely dead. The heavy, dense silence of the cheap motel room rushed back in, replacing his arrogant voice. The pathetic crying woman vanished instantly into thin air. I took a slow sip of my lukewarm tap water and stared at the glorious folder of federal evidence sitting perfectly organized on my digital desktop. He had recorded my fake tears to mock me in front of his friends, but I had just downloaded the absolute destruction of his entire professional and personal reality. I leaned back against the cheap wooden headboard and let out a genuine soft laugh. He had completely swallowed the bait without a single second of hesitation. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a helpless opponent. He had no idea I had already flipped the entire board upside down. Now it was time to step out of this motel room and start pulling the invisible strings that would bring his fragile empire crashing down on his head. The morning after my award-winning performance on the phone, I decided it was time to bring in professional reinforcements. I was a master at structuring corporate entities, but I needed someone who specialized in tearing them apart. I used a secure, encrypted messaging application to reach out to Thomas, Thomas was a former federal agent turned private investigator who specialized in high-level corporate espionage and forensic accounting. He owed me a massive professional favor from a decade ago, when I quietly helped him untangle a messy divorce settlement that threatened to bankrupt him. I sent him a substantial retainer fee in untraceable cryptocurrency and gave him one very simple directive. I told him to follow every single drop of cash flowing out of Richard's personal and business accounts over the last 12 months. I spent the next 48 hours confined to that depressing motel room, surviving on cheap vending machine coffee and stale crackers. I did not care about the hunger or the terrible mattress. My mind was entirely consumed by the hunt. On the evening of the second day, my secure inbox chimed with an incoming transmission from Thomas. It was a heavily encrypted folder containing over 2,000 pages of cross-referenced financial documents. Richard always walked around with his chest puffed out, claiming he was a real estate visionary. But looking at the messy, arrogant digital trail he left behind, I realized he was nothing more than a sloppy amateur intoxicated by his own greed. Thomas had completely mapped out the labyrinth of temporary shell companies Richard had frantically registered in Delaware and Nevada. Richard was aggressively moving cash out of the primary commercial escrow accounts and washing it through these fake consulting firms. I was paying Chloe a massive monthly retainer for marketing services she never actually provided. But as I dug deeper into a subfolder labeled Federal Mortgages, my initial amusement vanished and a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. I clicked open a massive 90-page document. It was a commercial loan application submitted to one of the largest federally insured banks in the country. Richard had applied for an emergency $10 million line of credit. The collateral listed for this massive loan was the crown jewel of our real estate portfolio. It was a massive downtown office building that I had personally negotiated and secured 7 years ago. But because that property was technically owned by the master trust, he legally needed my explicit written consent to leverage it. I scrolled down to the final signature page. My breath caught in my throat. Right there on the bottom line next to the shiny digital notary stamp was my signature. I leaned so close to the screen that my nose almost touched the glass. It was a remarkably good forgery. The sweeping loop of the first letter and the sharp, aggressive angle of the last letter were almost identical to my natural handwriting. But Richard missed one tiny, crucial detail. I always crossed the middle of my letters with a very slight upward tilt. This signature was perfectly flat. He had likely used a high-end digital tracing program to copy an old signature from a past contract. And the notary public who stamped the document was a junior legal clerk who worked directly under Richard in our corporate office. He had intimidated a young employee into participating in a massive federal crime. I was not just draining the company accounts to buy a fancy penthouse for his young, pregnant mistress. He was literally betting the entire foundation of the empire on a desperate cash grab. Submitting a forged signature to a federally insured institution to secure millions of dollars is not a simple civil dispute over marital assets. It is textbook federal wire fraud. It is aggravated identity theft. It is a severe felony that carries a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I sat back in my rickety wooden chair and stared at the glowing screen. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. The absolute sheer stupidity of this man was breathtaking. If he had simply asked me for a divorce and walked away, I might have let him keep a small piece of the operating company just to avoid a messy public scandal. But by forging my name on a federal banking document, he had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. He had practically gift-wrapped his own destruction and handed it to me on a silver platter. I immediately downloaded the forged documents and added them to my growing secure vault of criminal evidence. Just as I was categorizing the fake notary stamps, my cheap prepaid burner phone vibrated loudly against the desk. I had only given this specific number to my lawyers and to Thomas. I frowned and picked up the device. The caller identification displayed a local number that I vaguely recognized. I pressed the accept button and held the phone cautiously to my ear without saying a word. A woman spoke. Her voice dripped with an exaggerated syrupy sweetness that instantly made my skin crawl. It was Susan, Richard's older sister. Susan and I had never been friends. For 12 years, she had looked down her surgically enhanced nose at me. Because I came from a working-class family while she paraded around spending her dwindling inheritance on expensive country club memberships. She always treated me like the hired help, making snide comments about my practical clothes and my dedication to my work. Susan practically purred into the phone. She said she had just heard the terrible news about what her horrible brother had done to me. She told me she was absolutely disgusted by his behavior and could not believe he would throw away a loyal wife for a trashy young secretary. She insisted that as a woman, she felt a deep moral obligation to stand by my side during this difficult time. She told me she wanted to meet me for coffee tomorrow morning because she had some incredibly sensitive information about Richard that could help me win a massive settlement in the divorce. I listened to her melodramatic performance with absolute icy detachment. Susan did not care about loyalty, and she certainly did not care about me. Susan cared about money. She lived entirely beyond her means and constantly relied on Richard to bail her out of her massive credit card debts. If she was calling me pretending to be my loyal ally, it meant she was setting a trap to secure her own financial future. But in the art of war, you must always keep your enemies exactly where you can see them. I made my voice sound incredibly weak and grateful. I thanked her profusely for her kindness and agreed to meet her at a small cafe on the edge of town. I hung up the phone and looked back at my laptop screen. The web of betrayal was growing larger, but my legal knife was getting sharper. The air inside Benny Diner smelled heavily of burnt filter coffee and stale frying grease. It was the kind of rundown establishment located on the very edge of the city limits where the vinyl booths were taped together and the tables were permanently sticky. I deliberately chose this pathetic location for my morning meeting with Susan. I needed to paint a very specific picture of my current desperation. I wore the oversized gray sweater from the motel, threw my hair into a messy, uneven bun, and rubbed a tiny bit of gray eyeshadow under my eyes to simulate severe exhaustion. I sat at a corner booth nursing a lukewarm cup of tap water, waiting for my high society sister-in-law to make her grand entrance. The rusty bell above the diner door jingled loudly. Susan walked in looking like an absolute alien species in this environment. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere coat, an oversized pair of black designer sunglasses, and carrying a bright red leather handbag that I knew for a fact cost more than the average car. She paused near the entrance, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her nose as if the very oxygen in the diner was toxic. Her eyes scanned the room filled with tired truck drivers and exhausted shift workers until she finally spotted me in the corner. A look of profound pity washed over her heavily altered face, but I could see the distinct gleam of superiority dancing in her dark eyes. Susan slid into the booth opposite me, keeping her expensive coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders so it would not touch the cracked vinyl. She reached across the sticky table and patted my hand with a cold, clammy palm. She let out a long, theatrical sigh and told me how absolutely devastated she was when she heard the news. She said she had yelled at Richard for hours over the phone, telling him he was making a massive mistake by throwing away such a loyal companion. She played the role of the sympathetic sister, perfectly tilting her head and using a soft, comforting tone. But I knew Susan better than anyone. I knew she secretly despised me. I knew she only tolerated my presence at family holiday dinners because she relied on my financial generosity to fund her lavish country club lifestyle. I kept my head bowed and let my shoulders slump forward. I told her I was completely lost and had no idea how I was going to survive without Richard blocking all my access to our money. I forced a slight tremor into my voice, hoping she would take the bait. Susan smiled a tight, thin-lipped smile. She withdrew her hand from mine and unclasped her expensive red handbag. She told me that family always takes care of family, and she was not going to let me sleep in a dirty motel forever. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it carefully across the table toward me. I opened the flap of the envelope. Inside was a crisp cashier check made out to my name. The amount was exactly $5,000. Tucked neatly beneath the check was a heavy stack of legal documents printed on premium watermarked paper. I looked up at Susan, feigning complete confusion. She leaned forward, lowering her voice into a sharp, businesslike whisper. She explained that the check was a personal gift from her to help me secure a modest apartment and buy some decent groceries for the month. But the documents were a standard non-disclosure agreement drafted by Richard corporate attorneys. She said all I had to do was sign on the dotted line, promising never to speak to the press, to our social circle, or to anyone at the country club about the specific details of the divorce or the unexpected pregnancy of his new secretary. Susan took off her designer sunglasses, fixing me with a cold, calculating stare. The fake completely melted away, revealing the ruthless opportunist underneath. She told me I needed to look at this situation logically. She said Richard is a highly respected man in the business community, and a messy public divorce would ruin his hard-earned reputation. Then she delivered the exact knife twist she had been rehearsing all morning. She told me to be a good, sensible woman and just accept reality. She said I was 52 years old and my biological clock had stopped ticking a long time ago. She leaned incredibly close and whispered that Richard is a wealthy, powerful man who desperately needs a male heir to carry on his grand legacy. She said Chloe might be young and completely uneducated, but her youth gave Richard the one thing I was physically incapable of providing. She actually had the absolute nerve to tell me I should be grateful for the 12 years I got to live in luxury under his roof. She advised me to behave myself, take the small check, and walk away quietly before Richard got truly angry. She warned me that if I refused to sign the confidentiality agreement and tried to fight for his money, he would publicly humiliate me and drag my name through the mud until I had absolutely nothing left. The sheer hypocrisy of her speech was almost poetic. She was sitting there demanding I step aside for a young mistress while completely forgetting that I was the one secretly paying the mortgage on her own luxury condominium. She was lecturing me about Richard Grand's legacy without realizing that I owned the very ground he walked on. I stared at the $5,000 check. To a woman who had just had her entire life ripped away, it was an insulting slap in the face. But to a woman who possessed hard evidence of massive federal wire fraud, it was a hilarious joke. I slowly reached into my cheap purse and pulled out a plastic pen. My hand shook violently on purpose as I hovered over the signature line of the non-disclosure agreement. I looked at Susan with wide, tear-filled eyes and thanked her profusely for her incredible generosity. I told her I did not want to cause any trouble for the family, and I just wanted to disappear quietly like she asked. I signed the document with a messy, frantic scrawl totally unlike my actual legal signature. Susan smiled a genuine wide smile of pure victory. She snatched the signed contract off the table, leaving the meager check sitting in front of me. She stood up, buttoned her pristine white coat, and looked down at me one last time. She told me it was the smartest decision I had ever made, and promised to call me next month to check on my progress. I watched her strut out of the dingy diner, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the linoleum floor. She climbed into her luxury vehicle and drove away, completely convinced she had just neutralized the biggest threat to her brother empire. I picked up the $5,000 check, folded it neatly, and tucked it into my pocket. I had just secured written proof that Richard was using his family members to actively silence his victims and obstruct justice. The net was pulling tighter, and they were happily swimming right into it. 2 days after our highly staged diner meeting, my prepaid phone lit up with a lengthy text message from Susan. She claimed her conscience was keeping her awake at night, and she simply could not stand by while her brother ruined his life. She said she had privately arranged an intervention with the senior pastor of our church to force Richard into a fair, equitable financial settlement. She instructed me to meet her at the annual Grace Fellowship Charity Gala, hosted at the prestigious local country club. I knew immediately it was a blatant trap. Susan did not have a conscience, and she certainly did not care about equitable settlements. She wanted to lure me into a public space to secure her own position with her brother. But I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to push this ridiculous public charade. I put on a simple, elegant black dress I had packed in my small suitcase and took a taxi to the sprawling country club. The grand ballroom was completely overflowing with the local suburban elite. There were prominent town council members, wealthy real estate developers, and the entire pastoral board standing around sipping sparkling cider and picking at expensive catered appetizers. The room was decorated with beautiful floral arrangements and glowing ice sculptures. I walked through the heavy oak double doors, fully expecting to find Susan waiting quietly by the coat check room. Instead, the bustling room suddenly went completely silent. The soft classical music playing from the corner string quartet seemed to fade away into the heavy atmosphere. Every single head turned simultaneously in my direction. I felt 100 pairs of judgmental eyes burning directly into my skin. Right in the center of the massive room, standing on the small raised stage next to the main microphone, was Richard. He was not there for a private spiritual intervention. He had orchestrated a public assassination of my character. Richard was holding a crystal glass in one hand and gripping Chloe tightly by the waist with his other hand. Chloe was wearing a shockingly expensive white silk maternity gown that clung tightly to her body. She looked incredibly smug, batting her eyelashes at the wealthy congregation. Susan was standing right next to them, beaming with absolute pride like a loyal lapdog. Richard tapped his glass loudly, drawing everyone undivided attention. He looked right at me with a sickeningly sweet expression on his face. He leaned into the microphone, and his deep voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He announced to the entire congregation that God works in truly mysterious ways, and sometimes the Lord must remove toxic, ungrateful elements from our lives to make room for pure new blessings. He told the silent crowd that his previous marriage had been a dark, heavy burden of constant negativity and financial greed. Then he officially introduced Chloe not just as his new partner, but as his beautiful future fiancée and the miraculous mother of his long-awaited son. A collective gasp rippled rapidly through the wealthy crowd, followed by a smattering of very awkward applause from his closest business cronies. The wealthy women I had personally hosted at my own dining table for over a decade suddenly looked at me with deep pity and thinly veiled disgust. They began whispering behind their hands, shaking their heads at the pathetic, discarded older wife who had foolishly shown up uninvited to her ex-husband's glorious celebration. Richard stared at me from the stage, eagerly waiting for the inevitable emotional meltdown. He desperately wanted me to scream, cry, or throw a glass. He wanted to prove to the entire town that I was the crazy, unstable woman he claimed I was, but I absolutely refused to give him that satisfaction. I stood perfectly tall, pulling my shoulders back. I looked directly into his arrogant eyes, and I gave him the warmest, most serene smile I could possibly muster. I nodded gracefully until the senior pastor turned around and walked out of the ballroom with absolute, unwavering dignity. I did not shed a single tear on the dark, quiet taxi ride back to my miserable motel room. My heart was not broken. It was completely locked in a freezer, and my highly analytical brain was busy calculating the final trajectory of his total downfall. They wanted a public spectacle, and they got one. But their arrogant victory lap was about to hit a massive brick wall. As soon as I returned to my room and opened my laptop to check the encrypted holding accounts, I saw exactly what I needed to see. Chloe was no longer satisfied with simply stealing my husband and parading around in front of the wealthy church congregation. Her massive ego was growing exponentially by the hour. According to the digital internal corporate memos I was secretly intercepting from the main office server, she was now making massive aggressive demands. She had just sent a highly demanding email to Richard's senior human resources director. Chloe was demanding she be immediately promoted from junior secretary to the executive position of vice president of commercial acquisitions. She stated in the email that as the future wife of the chief executive, she deserved direct legal signing authority over all company bank accounts and real estate portfolios. She wanted absolute, unrestricted access to the very financial Achilles heel that kept the entire master trust hidden from public view. Richard was now completely cornered by his own elaborate lies. The young, naive girl he thought he could easily control was about to reach her greedy hands right into the jaws of my highly illegal trap. If he gave her that executive power, he would be violating the core terms of the master holding contract. If he denied her, she would throw a massive tantrum and expose his lack of true control over the empire he claimed to own. The beautiful web was finally snapping shut. There is a very specific type of silence that falls over a city just before dawn. It is a thick, heavy quiet that makes every small sound feel monumental. I was sitting at the tiny laminate desk in my motel room, wrapped in a scratchy blanket, staring at the frozen video feed on my laptop screen. My eyes were burning from exhaustion, but sleep was a luxury I could not afford right now. I knew Richard. I knew that his massive, fragile ego could not handle the humiliating ultimatum Chloe had thrown at him. He was a man who built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control, and she had just threatened to expose him as a powerless fraud. I simply had to wait for him to make his move. Around 2 in the morning, the motion sensor alert on my encrypted portal finally chimed. The live feed from the executive corner office clicked on. The room was completely dark except for the small brass desk lamp illuminating the heavy glass table. Richard was pacing back and forth across the expensive carpet, his tie pulled loose and his collar unbuttoned. He looked like a hunted animal. A few moments later, the heavy mahogany door opened and Chloe slipped inside. She was wearing a bulky trench coat over her pajamas, looking nervously over her shoulder. The Grand Chief Executive Officer and his demanding mistress were sneaking around their own corporate headquarters in the dead of night like common thieves. I zoomed in on the high-definition camera feed. Richard unlocked the bottom drawer of his massive desk and pulled out a thick stack of heavy watermarked paper. I instantly recognized the formatting. They were the official state equity transfer certificates. These were the exact legal documents required to permanently reassign corporate ownership shares. He laid them out flat on the glass surface. Next to the blank certificates, he placed an old closed business contract from 3 years ago. It was a document that carried my authentic, notarized signature. He was setting up a makeshift forgery station right in the middle of the office I had personally designed for him. Chloe stood anxiously behind his leather chair, watching his every move. Richard picked up a heavy fountain pen and began practicing my signature on a scrap piece of paper. I watched his hand move across the page, trying to mimic the sharp, aggressive loops of my handwriting. He crumpled up the first few attempts, tossing them onto the floor in sheer frustration. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Chloe leaned down and whispered something in his ear, pointing directly at the blank equity certificates. She was pushing him, urging him to just get it done. The absolute greed radiating from her was palpable even through the silent video feed. Finally, Richard took a deep breath, gripped the pen tightly, and brought it down on the official transfer document. He slowly and deliberately forged my name onto the primary authorization line. He did not just do it once. He forged my signature on the secondary addendum and the final beneficiary release form. But a signature alone was not enough to validate a high-level corporate equity transfer. He needed the official seal. He reached into the back of his desk drawer and pulled out the heavy brass corporate embosser. It was a secure legal tool that only I was authorized to use. He positioned the heavy metal device over the forged signatures and pressed down hard. The dull metallic clunk echoed through the hidden microphone. It was the sound of a man completely sealing his own fate. Chloe let out a sharp gasp of excitement and threw her arms around his neck, kissing his cheek. They actually thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bypassed my authority and secured her 15% stake in the empire. They had absolutely no idea that every single second of their little midnight crime spree was being recorded, uploaded, and securely encrypted on my offshore server in real time. Richard did not stop there. He was desperate to finalize the transaction before he lost his nerve. He booted up his desktop computer and logged directly into the state corporate registry portal. I watched over his shoulder through the camera feed as he fed the forged documents through the high-speed scanner. He filled out the online digital submission forms, explicitly claiming under penalty of perjury that all attached signatures were completely authentic and legally binding. He clicked the final submit button. A bright green confirmation message flashed across his screen indicating that the state had officially received the transfer request. I sat back in my cheap plastic chair and let out a long, slow breath. The game had just fundamentally changed. Yesterday, this was merely a messy civil dispute over hidden assets and a broken marriage. I could have simply frozen his accounts, fired him from the company, and left him completely broke. But by intentionally forging a signature on state business documents and submitting them through an official government portal, Richard had crossed a massive legal boundary. This was no longer a simple family court matter. This was aggravated corporate fraud, identity theft, and a severe federal crime. By attempting to give his young mistress a piece of my company, he had unknowingly invited the federal authorities directly into his living room. The state registry would eventually flag the unauthorized transfer, because the master holding trust required a secondary biometric verification that he could never provide. But the crime was already fully committed the moment he hit that submit button. I gently closed the laptop screen and looked out the small motel window at the empty parking lot. The anger and the betrayal I felt on the night of our anniversary were completely gone. They had been replaced by a cold, mechanical certainty. Richard and Chloe thought they were stealing a fortune, but they had just signed their own federal prison sentences. The trap was now fully armed, and all I had to do was hand the detonator over to the right authorities. The sun had barely crested the city skyline when I finally stepped out of that wretched motel room for the last time. I did not wear the faded gray sweater today. Before I left my sprawling estate on the night of our anniversary, I had managed to pack one specific outfit at the very bottom of my scuffed leather suitcase. It was a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit with a crisp white silk blouse. I had worn this exact suit 12 years ago when I marched into a room full of hostile creditors and legally bullied them into saving my husband from total financial ruin. Putting it on again felt like stepping back into my true skin. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight twist and applied a bold, dark red lipstick. The exhausted, discarded housewife was officially dead. The apex predator was awake and she was very hungry. I hailed a premium black car service and directed the driver to the towering glass skyscraper that housed the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state. The mahogany-paneled lobby of Bradley & Sterling smelled of expensive leather and polished brass. This was not a standard family law practice that handled messy domestic disputes over custody and alimony. These men were corporate sharks. They specialized in hostile takeovers, international asset recovery, and high-stakes federal litigation. I walked past the massive marble reception desk and ignored the confused look from the young receptionist. I already had a private appointment. I was escorted into a sprawling corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire financial district. Sitting at the far end of the massive oak table was Jonathan Bradley. He was a senior partner with silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and a reputation for completely destroying his opponents in federal court. He was accompanied by two junior associates who looked at me with a mixture of mild curiosity and professional pity. They clearly thought I was just another wealthy, neglected wife looking to squeeze a few extra million out of a cheating husband. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Jonathan stood up and offered me a polite practice smile. He gestured toward a plush leather chair and offered me a glass of sparkling water. He began speaking in that slow, comforting tone lawyers use when they are trying to manage an emotional client. He told me he had reviewed the brief preliminary details I provided over the phone and assured me his firm could secure a very comfortable alimony package. He promised to make the divorce process as painless as possible, fighting for a fair share of the marital home and maybe a modest percentage of my husband's business. I let him finish his patronizing little speech. I did not take a sip of the water. I simply reached into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick encrypted hard drive, placing it gently in the center of the oak table. I looked Jonathan directly in the eye and told him I was not there to negotiate a divorce settlement. I told him I was there to execute a hostile reclamation of a massive corporate empire and initiate federal criminal charges against the acting chief executive officer. The two junior associates exchanged a quick, amused glance, clearly thinking I was delusional. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, resting his hands on the table. He gently reminded me that according to public state records, my husband was the sole founder and legal owner of the commercial real estate firm. He said seizing the company outright would be legally impossible without years of grueling litigation and millions of dollars in legal fees. I did not argue with him. I simply pulled a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper from my briefcase and slid it across the polished wood. It was the original certified copy of the Master Holding Trust Agreement. I watched Jonathan pick up the document. He scanned the first few lines casually, but then his eyes suddenly locked onto the executive ownership clause. The condescending smile completely vanished from his face. His posture instantly straightened. He read the clause again, then flipped to the signature page verifying the registered state seals. He looked up at me, his sharp blue eyes wide with genuine shock. He slowly turned to his associates and told them to cancel every single meeting he had for the rest of the day. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted dramatically. I was no longer a grieving housewife. I was the absolute sole proprietor of a $25 million corporate structure sitting right in front of them. But I was just getting started. I connected my encrypted hard drive to the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the conference room wall. I told them that revoking his executive privileges was merely the civil portion of my strategy. I clicked on the first folder labeled Federal Wire Fraud. The screen populated with the heavily verified financial ledgers my private investigator had unearthed. I walked the legal team through the complex labyrinth of offshore shell companies and illegal escrow transfers. I showed them exactly how Richard had systematically siphoned $2.5 million of client money to purchase a luxury downtown penthouse for his 21-year-old secretary. The junior associates were frantically taking notes, their initial amusement replaced by intense professional awe. Then I opened the final folder. I pressed play on the high-definition security footage I had extracted directly from the executive corner office just hours ago. The massive screen illuminated with the crisp night vision feed. The room went completely silent as Jonathan and his team watched my husband standing at his glass desk in the dead of night. They watched in absolute disbelief as Chloe urged him on. They watched him practice my signature on scrap paper. And finally, they watched him forge my name on official state equity transfer certificates and stamp them with my secure brass corporate embosser. I paused the video right on the frame where Richard hit the submit button on the state portal. I turned back to face the stunned legal team. I informed them that the man on the screen had just knowingly submitted forged legal documents to a government registry in an attempt to steal 15% of my company. Jonathan took off his expensive reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. He let out a long breath that sounded almost like a laugh of pure disbelief. He had spent 30 years battling the most ruthless corporate criminals in the country, but he had never seen a trap this perfectly engineered. He looked at me with a profound new level of respect. He told me that Richard had not just handed me the keys to the entire castle, but he had also practically built his own federal prison cell. One of the junior associates quietly muttered that it was the most cold-blooded, methodical destruction of a human being he had ever witnessed. He meant it as a compliment, and I accepted it as one. I did not flinch. I did not show an ounce of remorse. I simply sat back in my leather chair, folded my hands in my lap, and asked Jonathan how quickly his team could draft the emergency revocation orders. I made my objectives incredibly clear. I did not want a prolonged legal battle. I wanted absolute, immediate devastation. I wanted every single financial artery keeping Richard alive completely severed before he even realized he was bleeding. I instructed the legal team to prepare the injunctions, the asset freezes, and the criminal referral packets. Jonathan leaned forward, a dangerous, predatory smile spreading across his face. The sharks had smelled the blood in the water, and they were absolutely thrilled to be unleashed. He promised me that by this time tomorrow, my husband would be locked out of his own life. The trap was fully loaded and my legal army was ready to march. The legal machinery of the United States court system usually moves at a notoriously agonizing crawl. But when you walk into a private judge's chambers backed by a powerhouse legal team and carrying undeniable high-definition video evidence of federal wire fraud, those rusty wheels suddenly spin at the speed of absolute light. Jonathan Bradley did not just file a standard legal motion. He orchestrated a synchronized financial airstrike. By 9 o'clock the next morning, his elite team had officially filed the executive revocation clause with the state regulatory board. With a single stroke of a pen, my legal authority over the Master Holding Trust was aggressively reasserted. Richard was no longer the untouchable chief executive officer. He was not even a junior employee. He was legally reduced to an unemployed civilian trespassing in my corporate headquarters. But stripping him of his fancy title was just the minor administrative appetizer. The main course was the money. We needed to sever his financial arteries before his arrogant brain even registered the pain. Armed with the foundational master trust documents and the undeniable proof of his forged signatures, Jonathan secured an emergency ex parte injunction from a federal magistrate. The seasoned judge took one look at the security footage of Richard stamping my corporate seal on forged equity transfers and immediately signed the sweeping asset freeze without a single moment of hesitation. I sat in the plush leather chair of the law firm conference room, sipping hot black coffee while I watched the digital guillotine drop in real time. Jonathan had his senior paralegals coordinate directly with the compliance departments of every major banking institution tied to my corporate umbrella. It was a beautiful silent symphony of absolute destruction playing out on the glowing computer monitors. First went the primary corporate operating accounts. The massive multi-million-dollar cash reserves used to pay commercial contractors and fund luxury executive perks were instantly locked down under a strict federal hold. A bright red restricted status icon flashed across my proprietary monitoring software. Next went his personal wealth. Every single joint checking account, every high-yield savings portfolio, and every platinum credit card attached to his Social Security number was frozen solid by direct court order. He could not withdraw a single dollar bill from an automated teller machine if his life depended on it. His digital wallet was now completely empty. Finally, Jonathan targeted the most satisfying piece of the entire financial puzzle. The private residential trust account holding the stolen $2.5 million for Chloe and her luxury downtown penthouse was completely seized. The illegal escrow transfer was legally halted, reversed, and flagged for a massive federal investigation. Her beautiful custom nursery and her private rooftop pool were completely gone before she even had the chance to pick out the curtain colors. In less than 24 hours, I had successfully drained the entire financial ocean out from under his magnificent pirate ship. But the most incredible part of this entire operation was the absolute eerie silence of it all. There were no loud police sirens screaming down the street. There were no dramatic dawn raids at the corporate office. There were no angry phone calls from bank managers. The elite financial institutions do not send you a polite text message, warning you when a federal judge secretly freezes your entire existence. They simply wait in the shadows for you to try and spend the money you no longer have. And Richard was about to try and spend a truly massive amount of money. While I was sitting comfortably in a high-rise legal office dismantling his empire piece by painstaking piece, he was busy planning the most arrogant celebration of his entire life. Through the intercepted corporate emails flowing into my secure server, I could see exactly what my newly unemployed husband was doing with his afternoon. He was completely oblivious to the massive, invisible legal net wrapping tightly around his throat. I truly believed he had successfully forged the state documents and permanently secured his young bride a massive stake in my company. To celebrate his perceived criminal victory and stroke his boundless ego, he had decided to throw a breathtaking $1 million engagement party. He had rented a massive 3-story luxury yacht scheduled to dock at the most exclusive private marina in the city the very next evening. I read through the digital vendor contracts with pure amusement. He was importing dozens of cases of rare vintage champagne directly from France. He was flying in a renowned private catering team from across the country to serve caviar and truffles. He had hired a 50-piece live jazz orchestra to entertain his wealthy country club friends and local politicians. He had sent out premium digital invitations to the local elite promising a night of unparalleled luxury to officially welcome Chloe into high society. He was eagerly preparing to stand on the top deck of a magnificent boat completely surrounded by his adoring sycophants and toast to his brilliant new future. I was perfectly playing the role of the invincible billionaire king, completely unaware that the heavy gold crown on his head had already been forcefully repossessed. He was floating on a glorious, fragile bubble of pure delusion, and I was the one holding the sharpest needle. I knew exactly how these elite private charter companies operated their businesses. They always required a massive final credit card authorization exactly 2 hours before the yacht officially departed the dock. The prestigious catering vendors would inevitably demand their final payments upon arrival. The expensive musicians would need their digital checks cleared before they played a single note. He was about to walk into a luxury event surrounded by hundreds of the most judgmental, wealthy people in the state, completely stripped of his financial armor. The stage was perfectly set for the greatest public humiliation of his entire pathetic life. I thanked Jonathan for his incredibly efficient work, gently closed my laptop, and walked out of the law firm, I needed to go buy a spectacular new dress. After all, I had a very important yacht party to crash tomorrow night. The warm evening breeze swept across the dark waters of the private marina, carrying the faint melodic sounds of a live jazz orchestra. I was sitting comfortably in the plush leather seat of my hired black luxury sedan, parked discreetly in the shadows just a few hundred yards away from the main pier. Through the tinted windows, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the massive 3-story luxury yacht floating gently on the calm tide. It was a breathtaking vessel, illuminated by hundreds of soft golden string lights that reflected beautifully against the dark ocean surface. But I did not have to rely solely on my physical eyes to witness the grand celebration. My secure laptop was resting gently on my knees, actively streaming the internal security camera feeds of the rented yacht. My private investigator, Thomas, had easily bypassed the outdated wireless network of the boat, giving me a flawless front-row seat to the absolute peak of my husband's staggering arrogance. The upper deck of the yacht was completely overflowing with the local suburban elite. Waiters dressed in pristine white tuxedo jackets navigated gracefully through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported French champagne and miniature spoonfuls of black beluga caviar. I watched the high-definition feed as Richard strutted proudly across the polished teakwood deck. I was wearing a custom-tailored white dinner jacket that made him look like a cheap imitation of a classic movie star. He held a lit premium cigar in one hand and a glass of expensive bourbon in the other, laughing loudly at jokes that were not remotely funny. He was completely surrounded by a thick circle of wealthy local politicians, real estate developers, and sycophantic business partners. A few feet away, standing near the lavish buffet table, was Chloe. She was absolutely basking in the center of attention. She had squeezed her pregnant body into a sequined silver evening gown that caught the bright deck lights and made her look like a walking disco ball. I watched through the digital camera lens as Susan approached her holding a glass of sparkling water. Susan was flanked by 3 other wealthy women from our local country club. These were the exact same women who used to drink my imported wine and eat the expensive dinners I personally cooked for them every single holiday season. Chloe enthusiastically raised her left hand, shoving her fingers directly into the faces of the older women. A massive, square-cut diamond ring sparkled aggressively under the string lights. It was incredibly gaudy and entirely disproportionate for her small hand. I knew for an absolute fact that Richard had purchased that exact ring using funds he illegally siphoned from my corporate marketing budget just last week. Susan grabbed Chloe by the hand, letting out a loud, exaggerated gasp of pure delight. She loudly complimented the clarity and the massive size of the stone, telling Chloe she truly deserved such a magnificent royal treatment. The other country club wives nodded in polite agreement, offering their shallow congratulations. The live jazz band finished playing an upbeat tempo song, and the lead singer stepped back from the standing microphone. Richard saw his golden opportunity. He handed his half-empty bourbon glass to a passing waiter and confidently stepped up to the small wooden stage. He tapped his heavy gold signet ring against a glass flute, commanding the immediate attention of the wealthy crowd. The gentle chatter died down, and all eyes turned toward the handsome chief executive officer. Richard smiled a wide, arrogant smile that stretched from ear to ear. He reached down and pulled Chloe up onto the stage beside him, wrapping a heavy, possessive arm around her silver sequined waist. He leaned directly into the silver microphone. His deep, booming voice echoed out over the calm, dark water and transmitted perfectly through the speakers of my laptop. He started by thanking all of his esteemed friends and elite colleagues for joining him on this beautiful starlit evening. He talked endlessly about the incredible, massive success his real estate company had experienced over the last 12 years, conveniently taking absolute total credit for every single brilliant financial strategy I had personally engineered. He told the silent crowd that he was finally experiencing the true joy of building a real family and preparing to welcome his long-awaited male heir into the world. His massive, fragile ego demanded a public sacrifice. He needed to tear me down to make himself feel completely invincible. He leaned closer to the microphone, lowering his voice into a cruel, mocking tone. He told his wealthy guests that leaving his past life behind was the most liberating decision he had ever made. He openly called our 12-year marriage a dark, miserable prison built on constant negativity and complete stagnation. He told the laughing crowd that some women simply do not have the basic mental capacity to handle the immense pressure of immense wealth. He actually raised his glass high into the cool night air and proposed a final toast. He told everyone to drink to his pathetic ex-wife, who was probably sitting alone crying in some filthy garbage dump right now. A chorus of cruel laughter erupted across the upper deck. Susan laughed the absolute loudest, clapping her hands together in pure sadistic delight. Chloe leaned her head proudly against his shoulder, wearing a triumphant, wicked smirk. They all raised their expensive crystal glasses and drank to my absolute destruction. I sat quietly in the dark back seat of my luxury sedan, watching the entire pathetic spectacle unfold on my glowing screen. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or sadness. I simply reached into my designer purse, pulled out a small silver mirror, and carefully applied a fresh coat of dark red lipstick. I looked at my reflection in the dim light. I was not crying in a garbage dump. I was sitting right outside their floating prison cell, holding the digital keys to their absolute ruin. The federal asset freeze had successfully propagated through the global banking systems. Now all I had to do was wait for the massive luxury yacht to dock and watch the spectacular, inevitable collapse. The cruel laughter of the wealthy crowd was still echoing across the upper deck, when a subtle shift occurred near the boarding ramp. I watched the live feed on my laptop screen with intense focus. The massive yacht was scheduled to detach from the marina in less than 10 minutes. The crew was already untying the thick mooring lines. But right before the final heavy metal gate could swing shut, a single figure stepped onto the polished teakwood deck. I was dressed in a plain gray delivery uniform, holding a thick manila envelope tucked tightly under his right arm. To the casual observer, he looked like a simple late-night courier rushing to deliver a forgotten package. But I knew exactly who he was. He was a highly specialized federal process server. Jonathan Bradley had hired the absolute best in the city to ensure Richard was legally served with the emergency injunctions in front of his entire social circle. The courier moved with quiet professional purpose. He completely ignored the trays of expensive caviar and the imported champagne being pushed toward him by the confused waitstaff. He wove seamlessly through the dense crowd of local politicians and real estate developers until he reached the center stage. Richard was still standing there, holding Chloe by the waist, absolutely glowing from the sick high of publicly humiliating me. He looked deeply annoyed when the man in the gray uniform stepped directly into his line of sight, interrupting his glorious moment of triumph. The courier did not hesitate. He looked Richard straight in the eye and asked him to confirm his identity. Richard puffed out his chest, looking down his nose at the working-class man. He proudly stated his full name, expecting some sort of apology for the rude interruption. Instead, the courier simply thrust the heavy envelope directly against his chest. The man loudly declared that Richard had been officially served on behalf of the federal court. He then turned on his heel and walked briskly off the yacht, disappearing back into the shadows of the marina. A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the immediate circle of guests. Susan frowned, setting her crystal glass down on a nearby table. Chloe looked up at Richard with a sudden flash of confusion in her wide eyes. But Richard simply let out a loud, booming laugh that completely shattered the tension. He gripped the thick envelope and held it up for the entire crowd to see. His massive, fragile ego immediately constructed a deeply satisfying narrative to explain away the awkward intrusion. He confidently told his wealthy friends that the thick package was nothing more than my pathetic, unconditional surrender. He loudly proclaimed that I must have finally realized I had absolutely no legal leverage against his massive corporate power. He assured the laughing crowd that the envelope undoubtedly contained the signed divorce papers and a desperate handwritten letter begging for a small monthly allowance. He said I was probably too ashamed to face him in a real courtroom and too broke to afford a legitimate attorney, so I had resorted to hiring a cheap late-night delivery boy. He spun the federal court summons into a magnificent tale of his own ultimate victory. Chloe instantly relaxed, leaning her head back against his shoulder with a vicious, satisfied smirk. Richard did not even bother to break the red wax seal on the flap. He did not read the urgent legal warnings printed boldly across the front cover. If he had just taken 5 seconds to open that envelope, he would have seen the immediate asset freeze orders and the total revocation of his executive authority. He would have seen the federal fraud charges staring him right in the face. But his blinding arrogance completely sealed his fate. He carelessly tossed the unopened package onto a small silver cocktail table right next to a sweating bucket of ice. He told the jazz band to start playing the music again and commanded his guests to drink up because the night was only just beginning. The loud brass instruments roared back to life, filling the cool night air with a triumphant melody. The yacht captain blasted the heavy horn, signaling that they were fully prepared to leave the dock and cruise out into the open ocean. But just as Richard turned to lead his young bride toward the luxury buffet, a new figure stepped gracefully into his path. It was the chief purser of the private charter company. I was dressed in an immaculate white naval uniform, holding a sleek digital tablet glowing softly in the dim light. He offered Richard a very polite, apologetic smile and gave a small, respectful bow. The purser explained that company policy required the final authorization of the event balance before the vessel could legally detach from the marina. He stated that the catering costs, the imported alcohol, and the live entertainment had significantly exceeded the initial deposit. The remaining balance was a staggering figure that would make an average person physically ill. He respectfully asked Richard to provide his primary payment method so they could finalize the transaction and begin the beautiful evening cruise. Richard did not flinch. He was completely intoxicated by the sheer power and the social dominance he felt in that exact moment. He smiled his arrogant smile and patted Chloe on the cheek. He reached his right hand deep into the inner pocket of his white dinner jacket. I was completely unaware that the heavy envelope sitting just 3 feet away from him had already stripped him of every single asset he claimed to own. He pulled out his sleek, heavy platinum credit card. It was the exact same card he had used to ruthlessly block my access to our joint checking accounts just 3 days ago. He held it out toward the purser with a dramatic flick of his wrist, expecting the transaction to take less than 5 seconds. I sat perfectly still in the dark back seat of my sedan, gripping the edge of my laptop. The spectacular domino effect I had meticulously engineered was finally reaching the very last piece. The heavy platinum card caught the warm glow of the overhead string lights as Richard confidently extended it toward the chief purser. He held it between his index and middle fingers with a practiced theatrical flair, fully expecting the naval officer to be suitably impressed by the sheer weight of the metal. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of my laptop in the dark interior of my sedan, holding my breath. This was the exact moment the invisible trap finally snapped shut. The purser offered a polite deferential nod and accepted the card. He produced a sleek black mobile payment terminal from his jacket pocket. He inserted the titanium card into the chip reader and held the device up so the satellite connection could process the massive 6-figure transaction. Richard turned back to his audience of wealthy sycophants, raising his empty hand in a celebratory gesture, silently promising that the champagne would continue flowing all night. The digital terminal beeped. It was not the pleasant, soft chime of a successful transaction. It was a harsh, flat electronic tone of absolute rejection. A bright red error message illuminated the small screen. The purser frowned slightly, his professional demeanor momentarily slipping. He politely informed Richard that the transaction had been completely declined by the issuing bank. Richard did not panic immediately. His massive ego simply would not allow him to process the concept of a financial failure in front of his elite peers. He let out a loud, dismissive chuckle and loudly blamed the bank automated fraud protection algorithms. He told the purser that his financial institution always placed a temporary security hold whenever he made a spontaneous luxury purchase late at night. He waved his hand arrogantly, instructing the officer to simply run the card a second time. The purser obediently wiped the metallic chip on his uniform sleeve and inserted the card once more. The machine thought for exactly 3 seconds before emitting the same harsh, flat tone. The red light flashed again. The officer looked up at Richard and quietly stated that the terminal was not showing a standard fraud alert. He read the exact error code displayed on the screen. The account was completely frozen and flagged for immediate contact with the primary financial institution. The confident, smug smile on the face of my husband finally began to falter. A tiny muscle in his jaw twitched. He snatched the platinum card out of the terminal and shoved his hand aggressively back into his tailored white dinner jacket. He pulled out a thick leather wallet and began tearing through the heavily organized slots. He produced a shiny gold corporate card. This specific piece of plastic was directly tied to the primary executive operating accounts I had legally severed just 12 hours prior. He thrust it into the chest of the purser, demanding he run it immediately and stop wasting his valuable time. The purser remained completely stoic. He slid the gold card through the magnetic reader. Another sharp beep pierced the cool ocean air. The error message was identical. Account frozen by federal order. The face of Richard flushed a deep, angry crimson. He was literally standing on a multi-million-dollar yacht surrounded by the most powerful people in the city, and his pockets were entirely empty. He frantically yanked 2 more cards from his leather wallet, dropping a few stray business cards onto the polished teakwood deck in his absolute haste. One was a debit card linked to his high-yield personal savings. The other was a secondary emergency credit line. He practically threw them at the naval officer, barking at him to process both of them at the exact same time. The purser slowly picked up the plastic cards. His polite smile completely gone now, replaced by the cold, strict protocol of a man dealing with a delinquent customer. He tapped the first card, declined. He swiped the second card, rejected. Every single financial artery Richard possessed had been surgically clamped shut. He was officially bleeding out on the deck of a rented luxury boat, and he had absolutely no idea why. Chloe stepped forward, her heavy sequined dress shimmering under the lights. The intoxicating illusion of marrying a limitless billionaire was rapidly evaporating right in front of her eyes. She did not have the sophisticated grace to handle a sudden public embarrassment. Instead of quietly supporting him, she immediately began to whine. Her high-pitched voice carried easily over the soft jazz music playing in the background. She tugged aggressively on his tailored sleeve, demanding to know why his stupid cards were not working. She complained loudly that her feet were swelling in her designer heels and she was tired of waiting at the dock like a common tourist. She told him to just pay the man in cash so they could finally leave the marina. Richard violently jerked his arm away from her grasp, snapping at her to shut her mouth and let him handle his own business. The sharp, cruel tone he used made her physically recoil, her eyes widening in genuine shock. The loud argument was the final catalyst. The upbeat jazz music suddenly felt incredibly out of place. The wealthy guests standing nearby had stopped drinking their imported champagne. Susan lowered her crystal glass, her eyes darting nervously between the naval officer and her panicking brother. The whispers began almost immediately. It started as a soft, venomous hiss spreading through the crowd like wildfire. I could hear their hushed voices picking up on the sensitive microphone of the security feed. The local politicians were asking if his real estate firm had secretly gone bankrupt. The country club wives were gossiping behind their perfectly manicured hands, wondering if the federal government was finally auditing his massive empire. The elite society that Richard had spent 12 years desperately trying to impress was turning on him in a matter of seconds. I was standing in the exact center of his own magnificent stage, completely paralyzed by a situation his arrogant mind could not comprehend. He stared down at the 4 useless pieces of plastic resting in the palm of his hand. Just a few days ago, those cards commanded absolute respect. They bought diamond rings, luxury cars, and silence. Now they were nothing more than worthless scraps of cheap plastic. He looked up at the whispering crowd, his chest heaving with heavy, panicked breaths. I was a king without a kingdom, desperately trying to hold on to a crown that had already been melted down. I sat in the darkness of my car, watching the beautiful, inevitable destruction with absolute cold perfection. The massive 3-story yacht groaned heavily as it scraped against the thick rubber bumpers of the concrete pier. The luxurious vessel had left the dock less than 20 minutes ago, carrying an arrogant king and his loyal royal court. Now it was limping back to the shore, carrying nothing but a desperate fugitive and a crowd of incredibly confused, wealthy socialites. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the marina, letting the cool, salty ocean breeze sweep across my face. I did not look like the exhausted, broken housewife Richard had kicked out onto the street just a few days prior. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing for this exact moment. I wanted him to see everything he was losing in the most vivid way possible. I was wearing a floor-length emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly over my figure. It was an incredibly powerful, uncompromising color that commanded immediate respect. I paired it with a heavy vintage diamond collar necklace that I had safely secured in a private deposit box years before Richard even knew my name. My hair was styled in a sleek, elegant sweep, and my posture was as rigid as a steel beam. I looked like the absolute, undisputed owner of a $25 million empire because that is exactly what I was. The darkness of the private marina was completely shattered by the blinding illumination of the police cruisers. 3 heavy tactical vehicles were parked at strategic angles, blocking any possible exit from the main loading dock. The local chief of police, a man who had zero tolerance for arrogant corporate criminals, stood directly to my left. He was in his full dress uniform, arms crossed over his broad chest, staring unblinkingly at the approaching boat. To my right stood Jonathan Bradley and his 2 senior litigation associates, looking like a pack of incredibly expensive hungry wolves in their tailored midnight blue suits. Jonathan held a thick leather briefcase containing the physical hard copies of the federal asset freezes, the executive revocation orders, and the criminal warrants. But the most devastating weapons standing by my side were not the police officers or the ruthless lawyers. Lined up perfectly behind me, standing in a formidable row of absolute corporate authority, was the entire senior board of directors from our primary partner companies. These were the men and women who controlled the massive commercial developments Richard claimed to manage. They were the key investors, the silent partners, and the institutional stakeholders who actually funded the luxurious lifestyle he paraded around in. Richard had spent 12 years kissing their hands and desperately seeking their approval. Jonathan Bradley had spent the afternoon showing them the high-definition video of Richard forging state equity documents and stealing millions of dollars from their joint escrow accounts. They were not just angry, they were completely insulted by his sloppy, amateurish greed. They stood on that cold concrete pier wearing dark overcoats, glaring up at the yacht with absolute pure contempt. The very people Richard was desperately trying to impress tonight were now standing shoulder to shoulder with me, ready to watch him burn to the ground. The heavy hydraulic gangway began to slowly lower from the side of the yacht, extending toward the concrete dock with a loud mechanical grinding noise. A pair of massive industrial spotlights from the police cruisers suddenly rotated upward. The thick beams of light cut violently through the dark ocean air and locked directly onto the upper deck of the boat. The blinding white beams hit Richard right in the chest, pinning him against the metal railing like a trapped insect in a display case. I could see every single detail of his absolute terror illuminated in the harsh, unforgiving light. His expensive custom white dinner jacket was completely wrinkled and soaked with cold, nervous sweat. His silk tie hung loosely around his neck like a broken leash. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled from his panicked sprinting around the lower corridors just moments before. He threw a shaking hand up to shield his eyes from the blinding police lights, but he could not block out the terrifying reality standing directly below him. He was completely trapped. The live jazz orchestra had completely stopped playing their upbeat melodies. The eerie, heavy silence that blanketed the luxury yacht was absolutely deafening. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the ocean waves against the fiberglass hull. The hundreds of wealthy elite guests, the local politicians, the judgmental country club wives, and the sycophantic business partners all crowded cautiously toward the railing to see what was happening. They looked down at the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the dark water. They looked at the federal agents standing with their hands resting on their heavy tactical belts. They looked at the furious board of directors glaring right back up at them. Then their eyes shifted directly to me. The woman Richard had just publicly toasted as a pathetic, weeping failure was standing center stage, commanding a small army of law enforcement and corporate titans. I saw Susan leaning over the glass railing, her jaw literally hanging open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Her expensive crystal champagne flute slipped right from her manicured fingers and shattered loudly against the polished teakwood deck. Chloe pushed her way to the front, standing next to Richard in her gaudy silver sequin maternity dress. She looked down at the police cars and then looked up at Richard, completely terrified. She was finally realizing that the limitless billionaire she thought she had successfully trapped was actually just a hollow, pathetic illusion. The heavy metal gangway finally made contact with the concrete pier, locking firmly into place with a loud, echoing thud. The sound was exactly like a massive wooden gavel dropping in a completely silent courtroom. Richard did not move a single muscle. He was completely frozen, staring down at me with a sickening mixture of deep horror, profound regret, and utter total defeat. He knew he had absolutely nowhere to run and no one left to manipulate. The dark open ocean was behind him, and the federal authorities were waiting directly in front of him. I did not yell his name. I did not point my finger or gloat about my massive victory. I just stood there, bathed in the alternating red and blue glow of the flashing police lights, maintaining absolute, perfect, unbroken eye contact with the arrogant man who had foolishly tried to destroy my entire life. I gave him the exact same terrifyingly calm smile I had given him the night he handed me those useless divorce papers. It was a cold, calculated smile that promised absolute, total devastation. The arrogant fake king had officially been stripped of his stolen crown, his stolen castle, and his stolen gold. Now it was time for the true queen to step onto the final board and claim her spectacular checkmate. The crisp ocean wind carried the heavy scent of salt and absolute panic. I gestured to Jonathan, who was standing calmly by the main power terminal of the marina. He had already commandeered the massive digital billboard that normally displayed the luxury yacht club advertisements. With a simple tap on his tablet, the bright, colorful advertisements vanished. The enormous screen flickered for a brief second before projecting a massive, high-definition image directly into the dark night sky. The sheer scale of this projection made it impossible for anyone on the yacht or the surrounding docks to look away. The video started playing. It was the crystal-clear security footage from the executive corner office recorded just 24 hours ago. The giant screen illuminated Richard pacing back and forth in his unbuttoned shirt, looking like a desperate criminal in the dead of night. Then Chloe appeared on the screen wearing her oversized trench coat. The hidden microphone audio was perfectly synchronized and amplified through the harbor public address system. Every single wealthy guest, every local politician, and every member of the corporate board of directors heard the undeniable truth echoing across the water. The crowd watched in absolute stunned silence as Richard pulled the state equity transfer certificates from his desk drawer. They heard him cursing under his breath as he repeatedly practiced forging my signature on scrap pieces of paper. They heard Chloe pushing him, urging him to steal a 15% stake in the massive real estate empire. Her greedy, demanding voice rang out loud and clear for her new high society friends to hear. The wealthy country club women who had just been admiring her massive diamond ring recoiled in sheer disgust, stepping back as if she carried a contagious disease. Susan stood completely frozen at the front railing of the yacht, her face drained of all color. The perfect, sophisticated brother she constantly bragged about was currently being broadcast committing a severe federal felony on a massive digital billboard. I could see her hands shaking violently as she gripped her expensive designer purse. She had tried to pay me $5,000 to disappear quietly to protect this incredible family legacy. Now that very legacy was being publicly incinerated in front of the most powerful people in the entire city. I watched the live audience reaction with intense, cold satisfaction. When Richard on the screen finally brought the heavy brass corporate embosser down on the forged document sealing his federal crime, the loud metallic clunk echoed through the marina speakers like a gunshot. The physical Richard standing on the deck of the yacht completely collapsed inward. His broad shoulders slumped and his knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the polished wooden rail just to keep himself from falling to the floor. The illusion of the self-made billionaire was permanently shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. He was not a king. He was a pathetic, desperate thief who had been caught red-handed by the very woman he tried to throw away like garbage. The profound silence on the yacht abruptly shattered. Chloe realized the massive federal trap she had just walked into. The intoxicating fantasy of marrying a powerful chief executive officer vanished, replaced instantly by the terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence. She did not stand by her man. She did not offer him comfort or support. Like a cornered rat, she immediately turned entirely against him in a desperate bid to save her own skin. Chloe backed away from Richard as if he were suddenly covered in flames. She started waving her hands frantically in the air, her gaudy silver-sequined dress catching the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers. Her high-pitched voice cracked as she began screaming at the top of her lungs, trying to project her desperate lies across the water to the federal agent standing beside me. She yelled that she had absolutely no idea what he was doing in that office. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at Richard, screaming that he was a manipulative liar who forced her to go along with his crazy schemes. She claimed she was just an innocent, naive junior secretary who trusted her boss, and that she never wanted any part of his illegal corporate fraud. Richard turned to look at her, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. The young, beautiful mistress he had literally risked his entire empire to impress was now viciously throwing him under the bus in front of hundreds of people. He reached out a trembling hand, trying to quiet her down to stop her from shouting out confessions, but she violently swatted his arm away. She kept screaming that he was the one who printed the fake documents and he was the one who stole the company money to buy the downtown penthouse. She was practically crying, begging the police officers on the dock to believe that she was just a victim of his aggressive manipulation. The entire upper deck of the luxury yacht dissolved into absolute chaos. The wealthy investors and the corporate board members were loudly demanding answers, shouting down at Richard and threatening massive civil lawsuits. The local politicians were frantically calling their own public relations teams, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive criminal standing right next to them. Susan finally found her voice and started screaming at Chloe, calling her a filthy gold digger who ruined their prestigious family name. Chloe screamed right back at Susan, mocking her massive credit card debt and her fake aristocratic attitude. I stood on the concrete pier, completely untouched by the screaming and the panic. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults or defend my honor. The massive digital billboard towering above the marina had done all the talking for me. The undeniable truth was playing on a continuous loop, illuminating their greed, their betrayal, and their absolute stupidity for the entire world to see. Richard looked down at me from the deck of his rented yacht, his face a mask of total devastation. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse or beg for a shred of mercy. But the booming voice of the city police chief echoed through a heavy bullhorn, cutting him off completely. The final act of the play was over, and the harsh reality of justice was actively boarding the ship. The heavy, suffocating silence hanging over the dark marina was suddenly shattered by a sound that was halfway between a furious, animalistic roar and a desperate, hysterical laugh. Richard pushed himself violently away from the polished teakwood railing, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He stomped his expensive Italian leather shoe against the pristine deck of the luxury yacht, as if he was trying to physically crush the terrifying reality of what was happening right in front of him. He pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me and screamed at the top of his lungs that this was all a massive, elaborate bluff designed by a crazy woman. His deep, booming voice cracked with sheer, unadulterated panic, but he forced the volume higher and higher, desperately trying to convince the whispering wealthy crowd and the furious board of directors that he was still the undisputed king of his vast empire. He yelled that his name was legally plastered on every single corporate letterhead and bank account in the city. He shouted until his face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, claiming that he was the sole brilliant founder of the massive commercial real estate firm. He told the stunned onlookers that I was nothing more than a bitter, discarded, aging housewife trying to ruin his glorious engagement party with a cheap, highly illegal theatrical stunt. He turned wildly toward the federal agents standing down on the concrete pier and aggressively demanded they march up the ramp and arrest me immediately for criminal harassment and trespassing on his private charter. He puffed out his chest, squared his broad shoulders, and tried to summon the dominant alpha male persona that had successfully shielded his total incompetence for over a decade. He truly believed if he yelled loud enough, the nightmare would simply vanish. I did not flinch. I did not step back or raise my voice to match his frantic, pathetic screaming. True, absolute power never needs to shout to be heard. I simply reached out my right hand and took the thick vintage leather briefcase from Jonathan Bradley, who was watching the meltdown with a highly amused smile. I popped the heavy brass latches and pulled out a single massive stack of premium watermarked paper bound tightly by a thick blue legal ribbon. I walked slowly and deliberately up the metal gangway, my emerald green silk gown trailing gracefully behind me. The city police chief stepped respectfully aside, allowing me to board the magnificent floating vessel. The dense crowd of elite socialites, local politicians, and judgmental country club wives parted like the Red Sea, completely terrified to even make accidental eye contact with me. I walked straight across the polished wooden deck until I was standing merely inches away from Richard. The smell of his expensive imported cologne mixed heavily with the sharp, sour stench of his fear. He tried to stand tall and look down his nose at me, but I could clearly see the absolute terror vibrating rapidly in his dilated pupils. I raised the heavy stack of legal documents and slammed it directly into his chest. He instinctively brought his shaking hands up to catch the thick binder before it could hit the floor. I told him in a voice as cold and sharp as a winter blizzard to look very closely at the bold text printed on the front page. It was the original certified copy of the Master Holding Trust Agreement, complete with the raised state regulatory seals and my undisputed authorized executive signatures. I looked him dead in the eye and projected my voice so every single terrified person on that boat could hear the absolute, undeniable truth. I told him he had spent 12 long years playing the role of a brilliant self-made billionaire while conveniently forgetting exactly who built the magnificent financial stage he was currently standing on. I explained slowly and clearly, as if I was speaking to a particularly slow child, that the prestigious real estate firm he claimed to own was simply registered as a subordinate limited liability company. It was a minor subsidiary, completely owned, entirely funded, and exclusively controlled by my private offshore master trust. I watched the remaining color completely drain from his face as the heavy legal terminology finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. His mouth opened and closed silently, grasping for words that simply did not exist. I turned away from him for a moment to directly address the silent crowd and the furious board of directors standing in the shadows of the police lights. I told them that the towering downtown office building they all admired, the luxury estate in the suburbs he violently kicked me out of, and the massive fleet of expensive imported cars did not belong to Richard. They belonged entirely to me. I pointed a steady finger at the heavy platinum watch strapped to his sweating wrist and told him my trust paid for it. I pointed at the custom-tailored white dinner jacket he was wearing and reminded him in front of all his elite friends that my corporate accounts fully funded his lavish, unearned lifestyle. Every single dollar he had ever spent to impress the people on this boat was money he had essentially borrowed from my personal vault. I turned back to face Richard and delivered the final crushing blow to his massive, fragile ego. I explained that he was never a supreme chief executive officer, making brilliant financial moves, or conquering the competitive real estate market. He was simply an authorized executive employee. I was nothing more than a well-dressed, highly paid hired hand I had graciously allowed to sign daily operational checks and attend fancy ribbon-cutting ceremonies, because I preferred to work in the peace and quiet of the shadows. I let him pretend to be the master of the universe because it kept the investors happy and stroked his endless vanity. I told him that his executive power was a temporary conditional privilege strictly dependent on my continued goodwill and tolerance. And because he had foolishly decided to bite the very hand that fed him, housed him, and clothed him for over a decade, that goodwill was officially and permanently revoked. I looked him up and down with a gaze full of absolute Arctic ice, stripping away his final shred of dignity. I told him he was officially fired from his own life. I demanded he hand over the corporate phone, the keys to the estate, and the access codes to the company servers. I told him he was now legally trespassing on my time and my property. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but absolutely no sound came out. The heavy legal binder slipped from his trembling, sweaty hands and hit the wooden deck with a loud, devastating thud, scattering a few loose pages across the floorboards. The thick illusion of his grandeur evaporated completely into the night air. leaving behind nothing but a hollow, pathetic shell of a broken man. The city police chief and the two armed federal agents walked briskly up the metal gangway. Their heavy tactical boots echoed ominously against the wood. Cutting sharply through the dead silence of the crowd, the chief stepped directly in front of Richard, physically blocking his view of me and entirely invading his personal space. The officer did not offer a polite greeting. He stated in a loud, clear, booming voice that Richard was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He read out the severe criminal charges one by one, letting them hang heavily in the cool ocean air for every single guest to hear. Aggravated identity theft for stealing my legal authority. Corporate embezzlement for draining the client escrow accounts. Federal wire fraud for moving stolen funds across state lines. And the intentional malicious forgery of state equity documents to enrich his mistress. The sheer volume of the charges was staggering, completely destroying any chance he had of ever working in the business world again. The senior federal agent grabbed Richard by his tailored white shoulder and forcefully spun him around without an ounce of gentleness. He kicked Richard's legs apart and slammed him face first against the polished glass railing of the yacht. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists was the absolute most beautiful symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sweet sound of 12 years of disrespect, betrayal, and boundless arrogance finally coming to a decisive, brutal end. Richard did not fight back. He did not roar or scream or try to assert his dominance anymore. His massive ego had been completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. He simply went completely limp, sobbing quietly and uncontrollably into the cold glass as the metal bit deep into his skin. Chloe stood a few feet away, covering her mouth in pure horror, realizing that the golden goose she had ruthlessly manipulated was now a convicted felon being dragged away in heavy chains. Susan backed away into the crowd, hiding her face in deep shame, unable to process the absolute destruction of her family name. I stood tall and unbothered on the deck of the yacht, watching the federal agents march my ex-husband down the gangway toward the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers. Absolute power had finally restored absolute balance, and I was ready to take back everything that belonged to me. The wheels of federal justice usually grind exceedingly slow for most people, but they move with terrifying lightning speed when you hand the authorities a perfectly packaged criminal confession. Within just 1 month, Richard was standing in front of a stern federal judge wearing a bright orange jumpsuit instead of his custom-tailored white dinner jackets. Because I had successfully reclaimed absolute legal control of the master holding trust, his entire net worth was officially listed as absolute zero. The magistrate took one look at his obvious flight risk potential and the staggering severity of the corporate embezzlement charges and completely denied his bail request. He was sent directly back to a cold maximum security holding facility to await a trial he could never possibly win. His elite defense attorneys immediately dropped his case. The exact second his retainer checks violently bounced, he was eventually assigned a deeply overworked public defender who practically forced him to take a restrictive plea deal. He is now officially serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for aggravated wire fraud and corporate identity theft. There are no exclusive country clubs or luxury yachts where he is going. There are just damp concrete walls, a metal toilet, and 10 long, miserable years to think about the loyal wife he so arrogantly threw away. Chloe tried desperately to play the ultimate victim card to save herself from the sinking ship. When the massive public scandal broke and the corporate money completely dried up, she suddenly rushed to the local hospital. She loudly claimed the intense stress of my cruel, vindictive actions had caused her to suffer a tragic, sudden miscarriage. She desperately wanted the public sympathy, and she desperately wanted to avoid being formally charged as a criminal co-conspirator. But unfortunately for her, hospital medical admission records are incredibly thorough. The attending physician quickly confirmed that she had never been pregnant in the first place. The entire baby story was a calculated, disgusting lie designed solely to force Richard into giving her a permanent ownership piece of the real estate company. When that medical truth was publicly exposed by the local tabloids, the last shred of pity anyone had for her vanished completely. She was promptly evicted from her apartment because Richard had been illegally paying her rent with stolen company escrow funds. She is now drowning in massive legal debt, completely alienated from high society, and working grueling double shifts at a cheap retail store just to survive the winter. And then there was Susan, my arrogant, hypocritical sister-in-law, who honestly thought she could buy my absolute silence and my dignity for a miserable $5,000 check. For years, she had been quietly taking massive personal loans from the commercial real estate firm to fund her lavish country club lifestyle. Richard had always illegally hidden those personal debts deep in the corporate marketing ledgers. But as the sole legal owner of the parent trust, I ordered my aggressive accounting team to immediately call in every single cent she owed the company. The outstanding total came to over $400,000. When she inevitably could not produce the cash, I authorized Jonathan Bradley to place aggressive legal liens on her luxury condominium and her expensive imported vehicles. She was humiliated and forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, completely ruining her pristine, highly guarded social standing. She had to formally resign from the country club board in absolute disgrace and move into a tiny rented apartment on the wrong side of town. As for me, I decided I had spent enough of my precious life building towering empires for untrustworthy people. I authorized a total sweeping liquidation of the Master Holding Trust. I sold the entire massive commercial real estate portfolio to a wealthy rival investment firm who was absolutely thrilled to take over the lucrative downtown properties. After the corporate taxes and the elite legal fees were fully settled and cleared, I walked away with exactly $24.8 million in pure liquid cash. I did not keep the sprawling suburban mansion. I sold it to a lovely young family and packed my bags. I am currently sitting on the private sun-drenched balcony of my beautiful new villa in the south of France, sipping a very expensive glass of vintage wine. I took back my name, my absolute dignity, and every single penny I rightfully earned. So here I am looking out over the sparkling blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea, breathing in the absolute freedom I designed for myself. The heavy lifting is completely over. I spent over a decade standing quietly in the shadows while a deeply arrogant man paraded around wearing a crown that I forged with my own two hands. I let him believe he was the king of the world because I thought it was the right thing to do for my marriage. But I learned a very hard and incredibly valuable lesson on the night of my 12th anniversary. Never build a massive, glorious empire for a man and let him put his name on the deed. Do not shrink yourself to make someone else feel tall. Do not hand over the keys to your financial independence just to stroke a fragile ego. If you possess the brilliant mind to build a castle, you better make absolutely sure you are the one sitting on the throne. Take your own crown. Wear it proudly and never apologize for your own power. If my story has taught you anything, let it be this. When someone shows you their true colors, do not cry and do not beg them to stay. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they have won. Then quietly gather your evidence, build your airtight case, and strike back when they least expect it. Thank you so much for watching my journey from a discarded wife to an absolute conqueror. If you believe in the beautiful, undeniable power of real karma, please take a second to like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share this story with any woman who needs a reminder of her own incredible strength. Stay smart, stay vigilant, and always protect your peace. I will see you all in the next one.